If there's anything I have learned about the gaming industry in the past few years, it's that whoever is actually aware of how they spend $60 should stay on their toes. People should now be just as skeptical of the AAA title games with development cycles unintentionally lasting longer than 3 to 4 years as they would be skeptical of the rushed flavor of the year first-person shooter. Oh boy, guns and power armor in space, how original! I was really excited about Final Fantasy XV. I loved Episode to Sky, the Platinum demo got me even more excited with all the detail that seemed to be going into it, and after the major disappointment that was Metal Gear Solid 5 and the massive red flag that was No Man's Sky, I somehow didn't think I could be fooled like that again. I'm making this video to say that I kinda feel like I was. And as a fan, I really didn't want to say that about this game. So, as the title suggests, I'm going to give my reasons why I think Final Fantasy XV was ultimately a lackluster experience for its fans, and I'll also throw down my suggestions on where it could have improved. And when it comes to spoilers, this video is gonna be full of them. So if you haven't completed the game yet, by all means, go and do it. And then come back to see if you agree with the points I'll be making. I want to generate discussion about it, not just bash it. And trying to figure out what went wrong is a tough thing to do, because there were still plenty of things that I think this new game did very well. First, the gameplay, combat, and item usage was smooth, engaging, and heavily improved from its predecessors. Second, the main 4 characters are all likable in their own ways. My favorite was Prompto, and I was entertained with the smaller details between the dungeon running, like setting up camp, or more specifically, Ignis's cooking and Prompto's photography. It really captured the feeling that you were on an adventure with your closest friends from the perspective of Noctis. Third, from the start, there was so much room to explore, and the world itself was gorgeous, with some very interesting choices. A Final Fantasy game based off of our own world? Sign me up! And finally, the music! Oh my goodness, the music was fantastic, and I will be listening to it for the next eternity. I already know that some of the songs will be going down as franchise classics. So, as a little disclaimer before I talk about what bothered me, I still had a lot of fun with this game, and I'd believe an 8 out of 10 is a fair judgment for it. I just think there should have been more to it. I'm not saying at all that the game is disappointing because it's bad. I'm saying it's disappointing because it did not live up to the hype that it has been generating for the past 10 years. 10 years! For Final Fantasy fans, this is like seeing Half-Life 3 getting released. So the developers for this can't just make an average game or an above-average game, they have to knock it out of the park. They had to put their hearts and souls into this, and I'm sure that a lot of them did, and I commend and thank them for that. But for every person that did, I get the impression that there was another person who did not. So with all that said and out of the way, the big question: what was missing from the experience? I think one of the major problems right off the bat is that it's lacking in reasons to be fully invested in what is actually happening to the world and the characters. To me, it seemed like there was so much more happening around the characters than there was happening to the characters. I know there was a fantastic, driving, emotional story somewhere in this game. There had to be because of the bonds between the characters and the stellar performances from the English voice cast. But the main story was very poor in its execution and pacing. The story clearly has a beginning, middle, and conclusion, so it shouldn't feel incomplete, right? But it was. It had the meat, but not the potatoes. So many details of the story just ended up getting completely lost in translation, leaving me with more questions than answers about the characters, like, what was motivating them? Why were they on the side that they were on? Why is it necessary to do what they're doing? Why were they acting the way they were acting? How did they become aware of what the other characters were not aware of? And most importantly, why should I care about them if they barely show any sign of having a basic character arc? Nothing really seems to change about any of them, not even after the 10-year time skip, with the exceptions of Ignis going blind and Noctis getting a more realistic hairstyle. Plus, the majority of the side characters in the main story just show up for a chapter, maybe 2 if they're lucky, and then are pretty much never seen or heard from again when we get to the end. And with 14 chapters serving as the main story, the 15th being the epilogue, That isn't a lot of time for them to do all that much. As a result, you can't really become attached to any of them for any reason aside from the qualities they have initially. Like boobs. And speaking of boobs, the prominent women of this game can be counted on one hand, while everything else about it was a sausage fest. I knew that when I got the game, but characters like Aranea Highwind, and especially the leading lady, Princess Lunafreya, should have had way more interactions in the main story than they did. It seemed like Luna got a bigger part in Kingsglaive than she did in the actual game, which brings me to my next point. The decision to make Kingsglaive and Brotherhood was not a good one. Sure, a movie and an anime introducing the world of Eos is cool and all, but not when you leave those details of the storyline out of the game you're trying to promote. To the people like me who just got the game thinking everything would be explained on its own, congratulations, you did it wrong. But it isn't your fault. If you want to understand the opening parts of the story and some of the details that become crucial at the end of the game, you have to watch Kingsglaive and Brotherhood beforehand. The game just plays out assuming you know these details already. And it shouldn't have to be like that, because Kingsglaive doesn't seem to be holding up on its own either. I mean, good lord! If there was a carefully constructed story for this game, the setup for it was essentially cut in half. But Kingsglaive and Brotherhood definitely aren't the only pieces of the puzzle that were missing. A lot of the events of the game just seem to be cut out or broken down to very small sequences. Just look at some of the trailers and demos for the game, and you can tell there was supposed to be so much more than what we got in certain specific areas. Some parts of the trailers featured fights in the city of Insomnia during the daytime, implying that the game could have opened with Noctis fleeing the city after shit hits the fan. But no. Instead, the game opens with him already out of town with a broken down car. And some parts of the chapters feel like there should have been more than just a tiny segment of gameplay and then more cutscenes. Some examples. Noctis trying to return to Insomnia, but then later realizing he has to flee? Could have been a full dungeon. The power plant in Lestalem? Could have been a full dungeon. Altissia during the Imperial invasion and the Leviathan encounter? Could have been a full dungeon and an absolutely epic boss fight. And that one is a special case because we clearly see what it could have been in the E3 2013 trailer. But what we got instead was one hallway of enemies, a series of QuickTime events, some cutscenes, and something that barely counted as a boss fight because the game was pretty much playing itself at that point. All you can really do is fumble around until the next cutscene triggers, and that doesn't make for a fun fight. I mean, just... come on, Square. We wanted this and not frickin'... press button and you win! Not only that, but after Altissia, the game takes a dive in quality when it should be pulling out all the stops and throwing the characters full force into the second, darker act of the story. Which they kinda did. You're given a whole world to explore, and every chapter before 9 seemed to be well done and well paced for a game in this kind of setting. But then, once you're past Altissia, you're set on a train speeding in a straight line for the whole rest of the second act. As much as Final Fantasy fans love to rag on Final Fantasy XIII for being too linear in the beginning and not having an open world to explore until the very end, this game pretty much did the same thing but in reverse order. I think the second half of the game would have been so much stronger if Niflheim were open world as well. And maybe with a bit more of a challenge. Stronger enemy Imperials, bigger and more fortified bases that are difficult to navigate unscathed, being constantly on the run in enemy territory. It seems like we never really got to face the full might of Niflheim's empire. Just your standard grunts, a couple commanders, and a hot mercenary. Love at first sight. And instead of expanding on that further, they all just get zombified by the end, barely making it a challenge anymore aside from... what's his name, who is somehow related to Lunafreya but also a giant asshole. The concept of having shorter days would have also been a bigger challenge too in an open-world Niflheim, which would have forced you to be a bit more careful about your decisions when traveling between towns and dungeons. But all you really get for chapters 10 to 14 are these strictly linear pathways and scripted fight scenes that aren't all that difficult if you've got enough items stocked up. And oh man, is chapter 13 just a long, boring slog after the first 15 minutes. If you cut it down to a third of what it was, you probably could have had room to make full dungeons out of the places I suggested. And when it gets to the 10-year time skip that seems more like just a metaphor for the game's own development cycle than serving a purpose to the story, we go back to Lucis and the world of Ruin. This is the only part of the game that should have been linear, but still not as strictly as it was. Why can't we return to some of the other places in Lucis? It might have been cooler if Noctis reappears in the western side, struggling to make it to Cape Cayam for safety because the lighthouse provides enough light to ward off monsters. Then maybe you reunite with the others in Lestalem, fight your way to Hammerhead, and then go retake Insomnia with your friends in their badass Kingsglaive gear. Maybe some of the other established characters make a return too, some of them now being capable of holding their own in what is supposed to be an apocalyptic world. I don't like how they're only mentioned in passing and living far away in Altissia. And why did it seem like just a casual night drive with Talcott to Hammerhead when the monsters here should be tearing his car to frickin' shreds? Some bits of the reunion were nice though, like having one last meal before the final fight and getting ready to go kick some immortal usurper ass. But when you actually get to Insomnia, it's a pretty mild and desolate experience until you get to the boss that was teased at the beginning of the game. It would have been cool if the Regalia had survived until that point, so you could ride in style, barely making it into the city, but that part was made for the chapter before this. Oh well. Ifrit was pretty easy too. I had more trouble with some of the monsters on the way there than I did while fighting him. It was a fun and epic fight, but it should have been harder. And as usual, when you use a summon, it's like pressing the I win button. And the final boss fight with Arden was even easier. There weren't any monstrous final forms or anything where the sky starts raining fire and blood. You're just Noctis going one-on-one with him as you both go Super Saiyan. As long as you have a Phoenix down just in case, you should have no trouble at all with him. You kill him, and then you kill yourself while your friends die protecting you because you have to bring back the light to the world by killing him again in the afterlife, or something like that. I couldn't really follow, to be honest. You say your final goodbyes, you take one of Prompto's pictures with you, and everyone dies a heroic death. So fans that see all this go down should be getting emotional. But I don't think the stakes were raised enough. I don't think the characters grew enough. And I don't think the end goal and their sacrifices are explained enough to justify that reaction from the players. This is supposed to be a tragic story about a prince, his father, his love interest, and his bodyguards who all find out they're destined to die so that everyone else can survive. But the game didn't really communicate that well enough for it to hit home. The post-credits scene where Noctis has a very touching moment with his friends at camp, knowing this will be goodbye, has no reason to be there instead of being before the final fight like it should have been chronologically. When we see the sun rise, we don't see any of the other characters witnessing it. And as a personal preference, I think the music choice for that scene and the ending credits should have been the other song that Florence and the Machine made for the game, I Will Be. Do yourself a favor and listen to it if you haven't. After that, you get a cutscene with Noctis and Luna happily married, which is okay, I guess, assuming it's the afterlife. If it isn't, then I really did lose all sense of being able to follow the story of this game. But there is one last detail about the ending that didn't help my experience at all. If you're looking at the footage I have and you're noticing something off about it, you're correct. Because Ignis glitched and turned invisible for the entire final chapter! I heard that the director said that the ending was going to make fans cry, but I didn't expect that to mean I would be crying of laughter. So even if it was the Casablanca of video game cutscenes, whatever heavy, emotional moments that were there got ruined because Ignis decided to go ninja mode during the whole thing. For a game that developers claimed they needed extra time to polish, I encountered quite a few glitches without really trying to look for them. At their best, they're goofy or weird moments that you laugh at for a bit and then move on, and at their worst, they break the game, making you lose function in your controls and forcing you to reload your last save. God forbid that happens in a dungeon that you completed but then decided to explore further, like what happened with me. This is something that absolutely should not be happening when a game is released, and it definitely made my playthrough that much more frustrating. I'm at least glad to hear that the developers are going to be patching things up and providing free updates for this game. I have no idea what the DLC will be like in the future, but I expect a decent amount of expansion. Maybe there will be a more positive experience down the road, but for right now, I'm not entirely satisfied with what there is for Final Fantasy XV. So, for a quick recap, 1. It's still a good game, and I think people should give it a try. but it did not live up to the hype it had been building for 10 years while being stuck in development purgatory. 2. The poor pacing and execution of the story led me to not being as invested as I should have been. 3. It didn't allow enough time in the main story for any of the characters to have their own arcs. That, combined with their individual motivations being unclear, made them all seem one-dimensional. 4. Kingsglaive and Brotherhood took away too much from the narrative, and the game just assumes you've seen them before playing. I don't like that. 5. There were signs that a good chunk of the content was cut, broken down, incomplete, too heavily scripted, or just simply missed potential to include something challenging and fun for the player. 6. The second half of the game should have had much more content, with Niflheim possibly being open world as well. It shouldn't have been just a straight line to the finish. 7. The final act of the game shouldn't have felt so rushed. The journey to Insomnia could have involved a longer and more difficult trip than just getting picked up by Talcott and walking there from Hammerhead. 8. The final bosses were not a challenge at all compared to some of the monsters that came before, and the ending fell flat because you never really get a chance to understand why the cost had to be so great. And 9. This game had all the time in the world to fix up some of the glitches, but my playthrough was still full of them, which hindered gameplay a little bit and took me out of the story. For a game that was hyped up to be a vast improvement over the other Final Fantasy games in the past 10 years, it sure did hit some of the same pitfalls. It's become a common trait for the franchise as a whole. Some aspects of the gameplay turn out to be really good, but then some aspects of the storytelling turn out to be really bad. For some of the games, you never really know what the heck is going on until you decide to do some extra reading, which can't possibly make a player invested if they just decide to pick up the game and start playing through it. The stories they're trying to tell are just so messy that it's sometimes better to just ignore it and enjoy the gameplay and be in the moment. But when you look back at the games that came before, you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to make that compromise. But what the Final Fantasy games do manage to do right, they do right. Nobody can tell me that video games are not an art form, because there's so much art that goes into games like these. I have never seen more vibrant worlds, more timeless soundtracks, and more creative character designs in any other gaming franchise, with only a few bad eggs. I would say Final Fantasy XV managed to be one of the better games in the franchise despite all this, but I hope that the developers will now know that they made some decisions that might have hurt the experience they wanted to create for this game. So what did you think? Did you agree with my points or disagree? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to discuss anything I might have missed. Until then, this is BWO Sandman, signing off.